The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, its light too weak to pierce the stained glass windows of the great hall. Inside, the air was thick and cold, heavy with the scent of sacred herbs and the finality of death. Torches spat and hissed in their iron sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted the faces of the assembled nobles into monstrous masks of grief and ambition. They stood in clusters, their whispers a venomous rustle of silk and velvet, their eyes darting between the stone bier at the center of the room and the man who was already carving up the kingdom in his mind. The king was dead, and in the silence left by his passing, wolves were sharpening their teeth. Marianne Locksley stood apart from them all, a ghost in a plain gray woolen dress, pressed into the deep shadows of a stone archway. She was nothing to them, a servant, a healer's apprentice, a face so familiar in its quiet servitude that it had become invisible. Her hands were raw from grinding herbs, her knuckles chapped from the lye soap used to scrub blood from the infirmary floors. She was supposed to be replenishing the ceremonial incense, but she could not move. Her gaze was fixed on the still form of Alpha King Thalin Rukmar, laid out on the cold stone slab, and a single terrifying thought screamed through the silence of her mind. They are all wrong. A tremor ran through her, a vibration that had nothing to do with the hall's chill, and everything to do with the impossible truth fighting for air inside her chest. The stillness on that bier was a lie. She could feel it, a thrumming low in her bones, a faint echo of the power that had once made the very stones of this castle tremble. While the others saw a fallen king, a body to be mourned and buried, she saw the subtle, agonizingly slow battle being waged within that scarred flesh. She saw the lie of his perfect stillness, a stillness contradicted by the faintest flutter beneath the linen shroud covering his ribs. It was a movement so slight, a moth's wing beat, that no one else, lost in their own plots and sorrows, would ever notice, but she did. It was a breath trying to be born. Her own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the deep, resonant silence where the kings should be. She knew what speaking would mean, the laughter, the scorn, the brutal dismissal. She was an Omega-born servant in a hall of alphas and betas, a field mouse declaring that the eagle had not truly fallen from the sky. And yet the truth was a physical weight on her tongue, too heavy to swallow. The king was not dead, and if she stayed silent, they would bury him alive. Lord Brennus, Thalin's cousin and the man with the hungriest eyes, stepped forward. His voice, smooth as oiled steel, cut through the murmurs. The moon of morning has set. It is time to prepare the king for his final journey to the ancestor peaks. The kingdom cannot wait. His words were a death sentence. The healers, their faces, grim and defeated, made to approach the bier with the sacred oils and wrapping cloths. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Marianne's throat. She saw the future spooling out in a heartbeat, the oils anointing still living flesh, the cloth suffocating the last ember of life, the stone sarcophagus sealing him in eternal darkness. Her entire life had been spent in silence, in making herself small and unnoticeable to survive. But not now, not for this. Her feet were moving before her mind caught up, carrying her out of the shadows and into the wavering torchlight. The lords and ladies turned, their faces a mixture of annoyance and confusion at the interruption. A servant girl, her face pale and her gray eyes wide with a terrifying resolve, was walking toward the dead king. Brennus's lips curled into a sneer. "What is this? Does the kitchen staff now have a say in the rights of kings?" Marianne stopped a few feet from the bier. Her voice, when it came, was not the timid whisper they expected. It was low, clear, and steady, though it cost her every ounce of her courage. It carried in the cavernous hall like the toll of a single solemn bell. "He's not gone yet," she said quietly. A beat of stunned silence, and then it came, laughter. It started as a low chuckle from a burly lord near the fire, then spread like a contagion. It was cruel, biting laughter, the kind reserved for fools and madmen. Brennus's smile was a slash of predatory triumph. "Child, grief makes us see things that are not there," he said, his tone dripping with false pity. "Our king fought the blighted ones on the border for a month. He took a cursed blade to the chest. The healers, the seers, they all pronounced him gone. His heart has been silent since yesterday's dawn." "His heart is not his only strength," Marianne insisted, her gaze never leaving the king's face. She saw the harsh lines carved by years of war and duty, The thick, silver-shot black hair fanned out on the stone, the faint tracery of a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was a terrifying man, even in death, a legend forged in blood and iron. There is something else, a fight, look. She pointed a trembling finger. Under the shroud, there. A few curious glances were cast toward the body, but no one saw what she saw. They saw what they expected to see, a corpse. The laughter grew louder, more mocking. Enough of this farce, Brennus snapped, his patience gone. Guards, remove her. She dishonors the king's memory with her hysterics. 2 guards, clad in the Rookmar silver and black, started toward her. Their faces were impassive, but their grips would be like iron. Marianne's blood ran cold. This was it. She would be thrown out or worse, locked in a cell for her madness. She had failed. She closed her eyes, bracing for the shame, for the rough hands on her arms. And then a sound cut through the hall, silencing every whisper, every laugh, every breath. It was a gasp, a harsh, ragged, desperate inhalation that was impossibly loud in the sudden, tomb-like silence. It was the sound of a drowning man breaking the surface, of a body fighting its way back from a depth no one had ever returned from. Every head whipped toward the stone bier. The shroud over King Thalin's chest rose, visibly and violently, and then fell. Once, twice. The hall froze. The guards stopped dead in their tracks. Lord Brennus's face, a moment before flushed with arrogant power, had gone the color of bleached bone. The sacred oils slipped from a healer's numb fingers, clattering on the flagstones with a sound like a cracking whip. The air, thick with the scent of death, was now charged with something else entirely. A primal, heart-stopping terror. Slowly, as if dragged from the abyss by the sheer force of his will, the Alpha King's head turned a fraction of an inch on the stone. And then his eyes opened. They were not the eyes of a man returning from a peaceful slumber. They were the color of a winter storm, silver and gray and shot through with an ancient feral light. They held no confusion, no weakness. They held only a chilling, absolute awareness. They swept across the stunned faces of his court, across the terror-stricken visage of his cousin, across the dropped jaws and widened eyes of the wolves who had been so eager to see him buried. They were the eyes of a predator who had just woken to find jackals circling his kill. Marianne stood rooted to the spot, her breath caught in her throat. The laughter, the scorn, it was all gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world had ended. She could feel the force of his presence, his very life, washing over the room in a tidal wave of raw, untamed power. The torches seemed to burn brighter, the shadows to shrink back in fear. He was not just a king. He was the alpha of alphas, the heart of their pack, and that heart was beating once more. And then those terrifying storm-gray eyes, which had dismissed 100 powerful lords with a single sweeping glance, found her. They stopped. They focused. In a hall filled with alphas and betas, with warriors and schemers, the resurrected king's gaze settled on the one person who did not matter, the one person who had refused to let him go. He looked at her, and for a heart-stopping moment, the entire world narrowed to the space between the stone bier and the invisible servant girl. He saw her, not as a servant, not as a woman, but as something else. His eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw not gratitude, but a terrifying, possessive recognition, as if he were looking at a piece of his own soul that had been lost and was now impossibly found. The king's gaze was a physical weight, a pressure that pinned Marianne in place more effectively than any iron shackle. The air in the great hall, already thin with shock, seemed to vanish entirely from her lungs. Around her, the world was a gallery of frozen figures, lords whose faces were masks of disbelief, ladies whose hands were pressed to their mouths to stifle screams, and guards whose spears trembled in their gauntlets. The collective heartbeat of the kingdom had stopped. Only hers seemed to throb, a frantic, terrified bird beating against the cage of her ribs, loud enough, she feared, for the resurrected king to hear. His eyes, those twin shards of a winter storm, saw through the servant's dress, past the chapped hands, and into the terrified soul that had dared call him back from the silent lands. With a sound that was half groan, half growl, Thalin pushed himself up on one elbow. The movement was a testament to an agony that would have crippled any other man, but in him, it was an act of pure, indomitable will. The linen shroud slid from his chest, revealing a landscape of muscle and scar tissue. A fresh, brutal wound, crudely stitched and blackened at the edges with a foul, blighted curse, marred the skin over his heart. It was a mortal wound. It should have been a mortal wound. But the flesh around it pulsed with a faint, angry red light, a sign of the war still being waged within him. His gaze finally broke from Marianne, sweeping over his court with a predatory slowness. It landed on Lord Brennus. "Cousin," Thalin's voice was a rasp of gravel and rust, the sound of a tombstone grinding against rock. It was weak, yet it carried an authority that cracked through the hall's paralysis. "You seem disappointed." Brennus flinched as if struck. The blood drained from his face, leaving a waxy, sallow sheen under the torchlight. He dropped to one knee, the movement jerky, unconvincing. "My king, a miracle. The goddess has answered our prayers." The words were right, but the tone was hollow, laced with the metallic tang of fear. He did not look at Thalin, his eyes fixed on the stone floor. A fatal mistake. One does not show a wolf the back of one's neck. A low rumble started in Thalin's chest, a sound so primal it vibrated through the floor. "Get up," he commanded. The weakness was gone, replaced by the chilling steel of the Alpha King. Brennus rose slowly, his posture that of a man awaiting a death blow. "You were so eager to see me wrapped and buried. Had you already picked out my crown for your own head?" "Never, my liege," Brennus stammered, finally daring to meet the king's eyes. "I sought only to honor your passing with the proper rites." "My passing," Thalin repeated, the words dripping with dangerous irony. He shifted, planting his bare feet on the cold flagstones and rising. He swayed, his body a taut wire of pain and power, but he did not fall. He was a pillar of scarred flesh and sheer force of will, towering over them all once more. "I was not gone. I was listening to all of you, to your whispers, your plans." His gaze swept the room again, and lords and ladies who had been whispering moments before now looked as if they wished the ground would swallow them whole. "The kingdom is safe. Its king is alive. Now get out, all of you." The command was absolute. There was no hesitation, no questioning. The nobles who had entered the hall to mourn a dead king and divide his legacy now scrambled to obey a living one. They fled, their silks rustling, their haste a clear testament to their terror. Brennus was among them, his face a thunderous mask of fury and humiliation as he melted back into the crowd of sycophants. The healers backed away, bowing low, their faces pale with awe and dread. The guards at the doors straightened, their allegiance snapping back into place with audible relief. In moments, the cavernous hall was empty. The silence that descended was different now. It was not the silence of death, but the charged, humming silence of a storm about to break. It was vast, intimate, and terrifying. Marianne was alone with him. She remained frozen, her mind screaming at her to run, to become invisible again, but her feet were led. The king, the living king, took a step toward her, and another. He moved with a stiff, painful gait, but it was the deliberate, unstoppable tread of a predator. The scent of him rolled off his body in waves, pine and cold iron, blood and the sharp, electric smell of ozone, of a power barely contained. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she had to crane her neck to look up at his face. The sheer scale of him was overwhelming. He was a mountain of a man, built for war and rule. The scars on his face and chest were a map of a brutal life, but it was his eyes that held her captive. Up close, they were not just gray. They were a vortex of silver and shadow, pulling her in. "You," he rasped, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "The others smelled only death. They saw only a corpse. But you spoke for me when I had no breath. Why?" The question was a physical blow. Marianne's throat was tight, her tongue a useless knot of muscle in her mouth. Words were a currency she rarely used. And now, under the gaze of the most powerful man in the kingdom, she had none. She could only shake her head, a small, helpless gesture. "Speak, girl," he commanded, though there was a raw edge of something other than command in his voice. A desperate need to understand. "Did a healer put you up to this? A seer?" No, your majesty," she finally managed to whisper, the words catching in her throat. Her eyes darted to the doors, to the shadows, anywhere but his face. His hand shot out, not with violence, but with a speed that startled her. His fingers, calloused and surprisingly warm, cupped her chin, tilting her head up so she was forced to meet his gaze. His touch was like a brand, a jolt of lightning that shot through her entire body. The contact was electrifying, a humming connection that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. No one had touched her with such purpose in her entire life. "Look at me when I speak to you," he said, his voice a low growl. "Tell me how you knew." I don't know," she stammered, the truth a fragile, inadequate thing. "I felt it, a flicker, in the stillness. Everyone was so loud with their grief, their plans. They couldn't hear how quiet you weren't." He searched her eyes, his own narrowed in intense scrutiny. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, see the faint tremor of pain that rippled through his muscles. He was a wounded wolf, and that, she knew, was when they were most dangerous. His thumb brushed against the soft skin under her chin, a shockingly gentle gesture from a man forged in violence. "A flicker," he repeated, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. He leaned closer, invading her space, and inhaled deeply, not with his nose, but with the primal instinct of his wolf. It was a gesture of assessment, of recognition, that sent a shiver of pure, instinctual fear down her spine. He was scenting her, like a wolf would scent a strange creature in its den. His expression shifted. The raw curiosity was now mingled with the Basad's deep, unsettling confusion. A frown creased his brow. "You wear the scent of an omega. Herbs and hearth smoke. Obedience?" He paused, his eyes darkening. "But underneath it, there is something else, something hidden. A lie." Marianne's blood ran cold. The lie. The secret she had guarded her entire life. The shame she kept buried so deep she sometimes forgot it was there. How could he possibly know? No one knew. He saw the terror flash in her eyes, and his grip on her chin tightened almost imperceptibly. "What are you hiding?" he murmured, his voice a dangerous whisper that was for her alone. "What is it about you that could hear me screaming from the other side of death's door?" He was a king. He was her alpha. He was a man who had just clawed his way back from the grave. She should have been terrified into silence. But something inside her, something wild and long dormant, rose to meet his intensity. "I am no one," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "A servant." A dark, humorless smile touched his lips. "No," he breathed, his gaze burning with a possessive fire that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with a primal, terrifying recognition. "You are the one who saw. You are the one who spoke. Whatever debt I owe for my life, it is to you." He released her chin, but his hand moved faster than she could track, closing around her wrist. His fingers wrapped around it completely, his thumb pressing down on the frantic pulse point. He held her there, tethering her to him, feeling the life that thrummed through her veins. "You pulled me back from the brink," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, possessive growl that was more wolf than man. "And now, you are mine to understand." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and irrevocable, mine. It was not a promise or a declaration of affection. It was a brand, a manacle of warm flesh and bone. His grip on her wrist held her tethered to a fate she had never asked for. Marianne's world, once small and safe in its invisibility, had been torn open, leaving her exposed and blinking in the harsh, predatory light of the Alpha King's attention. Panic was a wild thing clawing at the inside of her chest, screaming at her to pull away, to run, to disappear back into the shadows that had always been her sanctuary. But his grip was absolute, and his storm-gray eyes held a conviction that defied all escape. The immense strain of his resurrection finally caught up to him. A violent tremor racked his body, and the color drained from his face, leaving the skin stretched taut over the sharp angles of his bones. He swayed, his strength failing, and for a terrifying second, Marianne thought he would collapse. He gritted his teeth, a low growl of frustration rumbling in his chest as he fought the weakness. He leaned a hand against the cold stone of the bier he had just risen from, his knuckles white. "Your Majesty!" A new voice, laced with authority and concern, cut through the charged silence. Elder Cressa, the pack's head healer, stood in the archway, her face a mask of stern worry. She had clearly been waiting just out of sight, held back by the king's command. You are not healed. The blighted curse still festers. You need the sleep of restoration, not this. Her sharp eyes flickered to Marianne, a flicker of dismissal and confusion in their depths. Thalin did not look at her. His gaze was still locked on Marianne, as if she were the only anchor in a world that had tried to cast him adrift. The girl stays, he commanded, his voice a raw rasp, but the power behind it was undiminished. He released her wrist, but it was not an act of freedom. It was a dismissal of the need for a physical restraint. His will alone was now her chain. She will tend to me, Cressa's jaw tightened. My king, with respect, she is a grinder of herbs, a scrubber of floors. The curse on your wound requires skills she cannot possibly possess. It is a thing of dark magic, feeding on your alpha life force. She possesses the skill to see life where you saw only death, Thalin countered, his voice sharp as broken glass. He took a staggering step away from the bier and toward the massive hearth-warmed chambers that lay beyond the great hall. He did not wait to see if he was followed. He expected obedience. The rest of you can offer your prayers and your counsel at the door. She, and she alone, will enter. The command was a death sentence of a different kind. To be singled out by the king was to be painted a target for every ambitious wolf in the court. Marianne felt the weight of 100 unseen, resentful eyes on her back. Cressa's stare was particularly sharp, a mixture of professional pride, wounded authority, and suspicion. Marianne was an anomaly, a disruption to the known order, and the pack did not suffer such things gladly. With no choice, her legs trembling, she followed the king into his private domain. The royal chambers were as vast and imposing as the man himself. A fire roared in a stone hearth large enough to roast an ox, casting flickering light on walls hung with ancient battle tapestries. A massive bed, carved from the dark heartwood of a sentinel oak, dominated the room. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the lingering scent of the king's power. It was a predator's den, and she had just been dragged inside. Thalin collapsed onto the edge of the great bed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The brief, explosive return of his strength had cost him dearly. Sweat beaded on his brow, and the cursed wound on his chest pulsed with a sickly violet light that was visible even through his tunic. The poultice, he grunted, gesturing toward a healer's satchel that lay discarded on a nearby table. Cressa's work. It is useless, but it buys time. Redress it. Her hands shook as she retrieved the bag. Inside were jars of salves, clean linen bandages, and a stone bowl containing a dark, pungent paste. It smelled of silverroot and crushed moon petal, powerful healing agents, but they were tainted by the foul, coppery scent of the curse itself. It was the smell of decay, of life turned rancid. Approaching him felt like approaching a wounded wolf. Every instinct screamed at her to keep her distance. He watched her every move, his eyes narrowed, his pain-honed senses taking in every detail. She set the bowl down and reached for the hem of his torn tunic to remove it. Her fingers brushed against the hot skin of his abdomen, and a jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. He inhaled sharply at the contact, his muscles tensing under her touch. She worked in a silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and his harsh breathing. With hands that were surprisingly steady, she peeled away the old dressing. The wound was worse than she had imagined. It was not a clean cut, but a jagged, festering tear, the flesh around it blackened and necrotic. The stitches were straining, and at its center, a faint dark vapor seemed to writhe, a living thing of malice. It was feeding on him, and even his formidable alpha healing could not overcome it. "You are not afraid of it," he observed, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. Marianne paused, her fingers hovering over the foul wound. "It is just a wound, Your Majesty." "No," he corrected her, his gaze intense. "It is a piece of the abyss. The blighted ones do not forge their blades with mere steel. They forge them with hatred, with the essence of the void. Most healers cannot bear to touch it. Their own life force recoils from the wrongness of it." He looked at her hands, her small, capable hands that showed no tremor. "But you do not recoil. Why?" She had no answer for him, none that she could give. She could not tell him that she was intimately familiar with the feeling of a life force that was wrong. She could not explain that the silent, dormant thing inside her, the broken wolf, the source of all her shame, did not recoil from his wound because it recognized a fellow prisoner trapped in flesh. So she said nothing, instead dipping a fresh cloth into a bowl of warm water and beginning to clean the edges of the wound. He hissed as the cloth touched his skin, his whole body going rigid. The pain must have been immense, a fire in his very soul. But his eyes never left her face. He was enduring it, watching her, testing her. She worked with a focused efficiency born of years spent in the infirmary, her movements precise and gentle. She cleaned away the grime and the old salve, her touch light but firm. When the wound was clean, she took a generous amount of the poultice and spread it over the cursed flesh. As the fresh herbs made contact, the violet light flared, and the dark vapor writhed violently, as if in agony. Fallon let out a choked gasp, his hand shooting out to grip the bed frame, the thick wood groaning under the pressure. As she worked, bandaging the wound with clean linen, she was acutely aware of his proximity. The heat of him, the sheer physical presence of him, was overwhelming. She could feel the struggle within him, the titanic battle between his life force and the curse. It was the same battle she had sensed in the Great Hall. Only now it was a roaring inferno right beside her. "There is no wolf in you," he said suddenly, his voice quiet, dangerous. "I scented you, Omega, yes. Servant, yes. But beneath that, a void. A hollow space where a wolf should be." Marianne's hands froze. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. He saw too much. He felt too much. The secret she had protected with a lifetime of silence was being unraveled by a man who had been dead only hours before. I am just a human servant, my king," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the lie she had told 1,000 times. He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that was full of pain. A human who could hear an alpha's soul screaming, "Do not insult my intelligence, girl." He shifted, leaning closer, his face just inches from hers. The storm in his eyes was back, swirling with suspicion and a raw, unnerving possessiveness. Every shifter in this castle, from the highest alpha to the lowest omega, has a wolf. It is the core of our being, but you are a puzzle. A beautiful, infuriating lie wrapped in a plain gray dress. He was too close. His breath fanned across her cheek, smelling of pain and the herbs on his wound. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic prisoner, she felt trapped, seen, exposed in a way that was more terrifying than any physical threat. "What are you, Marianne Locksley?" he whispered, his voice a velvet growl that vibrated through her very bones. Before she could answer, before she could even breathe, the exhaustion of his ordeal finally claimed him. His eyes, which had been burning with intensity, clouded over. His body went slack, and his head fell back against the pillows. The iron will that had held him upright had finally surrendered to the profound need for his body to heal. He was asleep, or in a trance so deep it was indistinguishable from one. Relief, so potent it made her dizzy, washed over Marianne. She carefully finished tying the bandage, her hands trembling now that his watchful gaze was gone. She was safe, for a moment. He slept. She backed away from the bed, intending to slip out of the room, to flee back to the anonymity of the servants' quarters. His command to stay had been for when he was awake, surely, but as her hand touched the cold iron latch of the door, a soft click from behind her made her freeze. She turned slowly. Lord Brennus stood in a second, smaller doorway she hadn't noticed before, one that likely connected to the council chambers. He must have been waiting, listening. The door swung silently shut behind him, plunging them into the intimate, firelit space. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, unlike the king's stormy gray, were the cold, flat black of a frozen lake. They held no heat, only a chilling, calculating ambition. "A remarkable performance," he said, his voice a silken murmur that did not disturb the sleeping king. "From both of you?" Marianne backed away, pressing herself against the main door. Her escape was cut off. "I confess," Brennus continued, taking a slow step toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. "I misjudged you. A servant girl who can pull a king back from the grave. You are far more interesting than you appear." He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, dismissive and yet intensely focused. "He thinks you are a puzzle he must solve, a debt he must understand." A cruel smile touched his lips. But I am not so sentimental. I see you for what you are." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "You are a threat to the natural order, a flaw in the tapestry. And he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I have always believed in snipping loose threads." Brennus's words were a silken cord tightening around Marianne's throat. Snipping loose threads. It was a courtier's phrase, elegant and bloodless, but it carried the chilling finality of a blade's edge. The roaring fire in the hearth seemed to shrink, its light and warmth swallowed by the cold ambition radiating from the man before her. She was trapped, her back pressed hard against the unyielding oak of the chamber door, the sleeping Alpha King, a wounded mountain behind her, and his waking, scheming cousin, a serpent in front. Her entire life had been a study in avoiding notice, and now she was the focal point of the two most powerful wolves in the kingdom. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, the lie thin and brittle. Brennus smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips that held no warmth. "Oh, I think you do. You are an Omega, born to submit, to serve, to be overlooked. Yet you stood in a hall of alphas and contradicted them all. You laid your hands on a cursed king and did not flinch. And now he has pulled you into his den and cast out everyone else." He took another silent step closer, his dark eyes roaming over her as if assessing livestock. "This is not the behavior of a simple servant. This is the behavior of someone with a secret. And secrets," he paused, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, "are currency in this castle, or they are weapons that can be turned against their keeper." Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was fishing, circling the truth he could not yet see, but the danger was just as real. He saw her as a tool, a lever to be used against Thalen. "He is the king," Marianne said, finding a sliver of courage in her desperation. "I obey his commands." "Of course you do," Brennus agreed smoothly, "but his commands are born of weakness. The curse is eating him from the inside out. Did you see his eyes? He looks at you not as a subject, but as a talisman, a charm he believes will save him. That makes you powerful, little servant, and it makes you vulnerable." He was close enough now that she could smell the faint, cold scent of iron and parchment that clung to him, the scent of politics and ink-stained plotting. "He will not last. The pack needs a strong alpha, an unblighted alpha. When he falls, and he will fall, the pack will look to me, and anyone he has favored, anyone who propped up his failing reign, will be swept away with the rest of the refuse." The threat was clear. Side with the dying king and die with him. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice tight. His smile widened. "Information, proximity, tell me what he says. Tell me how the curse progresses. Help me ensure a smooth transition of power. In return, when I am Alpha King, your secret, whatever it may be, will be safe. I will even grant you a place of comfort. You will be protected." It was a poison bargain, a traitor's pact. The thought of it turned her stomach. She looked past Brennus's shoulder to the massive bed, to the still form of the king. He was a terrifying, possessive man who saw too much, but his power was honest. It was a force of nature, like a storm or a wildfire. Brennus's power was the cold, creeping rot that grew in the shadows, a thing of whispers and lies. "No," she said. The word was small, but it was solid. A stone dropped into a deep well. Brennus's eyes hardened, the pleasant mask falling away to reveal the cold predator beneath. A foolish choice. Loyalty to a dead man walking. He reached for her, his hand moving with a snake's swiftness, not to harm, but to grip her arm, to assert his dominance. "You will reconsider." He never finished the sentence. A sound low and menacing vibrated through the very stones of the floor. It was not a human sound. It was the guttural, chest-deep growl of a great wolf rousing from a territorial sleep. It was a sound of absolute lethal warning. Marianne's head snapped toward the bed. Thalen had not moved. His eyes were still closed, his breathing still deep and even in his healing trance. He was, for all intents and purposes, unconscious, but the growl had come from him. It was the sound of his slumbering wolf, his primal alpha spirit, rising to answer a threat to its domain. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The air grew heavy, charged with a raw electric power that prickled the skin. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and the king's scent, pine and iron and blood, thickened, flooding the chamber with an unmistakable, suffocating wave of possessiveness. It was a silent, olfactory roar that screamed one word: mine. Brennus froze, his hand hovering an inch from her arm. The blood drained from his face, and for the first time Marianne saw a flicker of genuine fear in his cold eyes. He was a powerful alpha, second only to the king, but he recognized this for what it was: a primal claim, a warning issued from a place beyond consciousness, beyond reason. It was the king's soul telling him to back away. Slowly, deliberately, Brennus retracted his hand. He took a step back, his eyes darting from Marianne to the unmoving form on the bed. The growl subsided, but the oppressive weight of the king's presence remained, a silent, watchful shadow. "It seems," Brennus said, his voice a strained, venomous whisper, "that his hold is stronger than I thought, even on the edge of death's door." He straightened his tunic, recovering his composure with a visible effort. His gaze on Marianne was now filled with a new, colder hatred. He no longer saw her as a potential pawn, but as an enemy. "Enjoy his protection while it lasts, servant. He cannot sleep forever, and when his eyes are open, he will still be too blind to see the real dangers circling him." With a final, contemptuous look, he turned and slipped back through the hidden door, vanishing as silently as he had appeared. The heavy tapestry fell into place behind him, muffling the quiet click of the latch. Marianne was alone again with the king. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. Her legs felt weak, and she slid down the smooth wood of the door to sit on the cold floor. The chamber was quiet again, save for the fire and the king's steady breathing. But the silence was different. It was filled with the echo of that growl, with the lingering, possessive scent of his power. He had protected her, in his sleep. A part of him, a deep and primal part, had sensed her distress and risen to her defense. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror and a confusing, unwelcome warmth through her. She was tied to him now, not just by a royal command, but by an instinct she could not begin to understand. After a few moments, she forced herself to her feet. She walked slowly to the bed, drawn by an invisible thread. She looked down at his face, at the harsh lines softened by sleep, at the thick black lashes resting against the high cheekbones. He was just a man, wounded and vulnerable, but he was also something more, a force that had reached out from the depths of its own battle to shield her. Her eyes fell to the bandaged wound on his chest. As she watched, she saw something impossible, the faint, sickly violet light of the curse that pulsed beneath the linen seemed dimmer, less angry. The oppressive, rancid feeling that it gave off had lessened, pushed back by the raw surge of his protective power. It was as if, by defending her, he had momentarily starved the curse of the very life force it fed upon. A terrifying thought took root in her mind, a realization that was both a revelation and a death sentence. The curse fed on his alpha strength, his life force, but his alpha strength, his very will to live, was now somehow connected to her. His protective instinct was a weapon against the darkness eating him alive. She was not his talisman, she was his anchor, and in a court of circling sharks, an anchor could either save a ship or drag it down to the unforgiving depths. Hesitantly, as if touching a flame, she reached out and laid her hand gently on his forehead. His skin was hot, but the raging fever had subsided to a steady, healing warmth. Beneath her palm, she felt it again, not a flicker this time, but a deep, steady current, the slow, powerful rhythm of a king fighting his way back to his throne. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was not the only one in danger. Brennus would not forget this, and the sleeping king had just shown his enemies exactly where to strike. Marianne awoke with a start, the crick in her neck a sharp reminder of her makeshift vigil. She had fallen asleep in the heavy carved chair by the hearth, the wool of her dress scratchy against her cheek. The fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, pulsing red light across the vast chamber. Outside, the first hint of a bleak gray dawn was seeping through the high-arched windows, diluting the shadows. The room was quiet, the oppressive weight of the king's unconscious power having receded to a low, steady thrum, like a distant ocean tide. She was alive. She had survived the night, A soft rustle of linen made her freeze. She turned her head slowly, her heart leaping into her throat. He was awake. King Thalin was propped up against a mound of pillows, his bare chest stark and pale in the dim light. He wasn't looking at her, but staring at his own hands, turning them over as if they were foreign objects. He flexed his scarred fingers, studying the play of muscle and sinew, reacquainting himself with the simple fact of his own life. The cursed wound, she noted with a breath of relief, was no longer pulsing with that sickly light. The bandage was clean, the tide of the battle within him seemed to have turned. Then his head lifted, and his storm-gray eyes found her in the shadows by the fire. He didn't seem surprised to see her there. He seemed to expect it. "You stayed," he said. His voice was no longer a raw rasp, but a low, gravelly baritone that resonated deep in her bones. It was the voice of a king who had reclaimed his breath. "You commanded it, Your Majesty," she replied, her own voice little more than a whisper. She rose from the chair, her limbs stiff and cold, unsure of her place. Was she his nurse, his prisoner? "I commanded you to enter," he corrected her, his gaze unwavering. "I did not command you to stand guard over my sleep like a loyal hound." The words were harsh, but his tone held no heat. It was a simple, blunt statement of fact. "And yet you did, I felt you, a quiet presence in the dark, a candle flame that refused to be snuffed out." He remembered. He had been aware on some level of her vigil. The thought sent a strange, disquieting warmth through her. She clutched her hands together, her knuckles white. "My cousin paid you a visit," he stated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I heard the tail end of his proposal. The sound of his voice was a viper hissing in my dreams." He paused, letting the silence stretch, demanding an answer. "What did he offer you?" Marianne's throat went dry. To tell the truth would be to accuse the king's own blood of treason. To lie would be a fool's errand with a man who could hear screams from the other side of death. "He offered me his protection," she said, choosing her words with care. "When you are gone." A dark, dangerous light flared in Thalin's eyes. "He is as impatient as he is foolish. The jackal grows bold when it thinks the lion is sleeping." He pushed himself to sit up straighter, the movement still costing him, but his strength was clearly returning. "And what of the growl? Did you hear it?" She could only nod, her gaze dropping to the stone floor. She remembered the sound vibrating through her bones, the primal force of it. "That was not me," he said, his voice low and laced with a deep confusion. "Not the man. It was the other, the beast. My wolf has not had cause to rise on its own, without my leave since I was a pup." His gaze barred into her, intense and searching. "It sensed a threat to you?" It answered. He was laying the pieces of the puzzle out between them, forcing her to look at them. He was telling her, without accusation, that she was the cause of this unprecedented event, that her presence had provoked a reaction from the deepest, most untamed part of his soul. "I owe you a debt," he said, changing the subject with a brusque shift in tone. "A life debt. It is a sacred thing among our people. It cannot be ignored." He looked around the opulent chamber, at the tapestries, the gold inlay on the furniture, the furs piled on the bed. "Gold is meaningless. A title is a target. What does a servant girl who saved a king want as her reward?" The question was a test. Marianne knew it. Her whole life had been about wanting nothing, asking for nothing, for fear of drawing attention. That instinct was now at war with the terrifying reality of her situation. She was already the center of the most dangerous attention in the kingdom. "I want nothing, Your Majesty," she whispered, and it was the honest truth. "I only asked to be allowed to return to my duties, to be forgotten." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a short, harsh laugh. "Forgotten?" he repeated, the word laced with bitter irony. "Child, you stood in the great hall and defied death itself. You are the whisper in every corridor this morning, the mystery in every lord's cup. Forgetting you is no longer an option. Not for them." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "And not for me." He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet hitting the cold stone with a soft thud. He stood, a towering figure of scars and raw power, and took a step toward her. She instinctively flinched back. He stopped, seeing her fear, a flicker of something, Frustration, perhaps even regret, crossed his face. "Every soul in this castle fears me," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Why should you be any different?" His eyes dropped to her hands, which she was wringing nervously in front of her. He reached out, not with the swiftness of before, but with a deliberate slowness that gave her time to retreat. She didn't. She was frozen. He gently took her right hand, his large, calloused fingers engulfing hers. He turned it over, his thumb brushing over her palm. It was not a soft hand. It was the hand of a worker, with chapped skin, small faded scars from errant knives in the kitchens, and the deep, permanent stain of herbs under the nails. "This is the hand that ground the herbs that ease the fevers of the sick," he said quietly, his thumb tracing a small silvery scar near her wrist. "This is the hand that cleaned the filth of others without complaint. This is the hand that was not afraid to touch a cursed wound." His gaze lifted from her hand to her eyes. "My body is a map of my life," he said, his voice a low rumble. He touched the jagged scar that cut through his eyebrow. "This was a wildcat during my first solo hunt. I was 10. His fingers brushed the thick, puckered tissue on his shoulder. "An assassin's blade meant for my father. I was 17. He didn't need to indicate the terrible wound on his chest. It was the latest, most brutal entry in his history. We are all marked by our battles, Marianne Locksley. Your scars are just quieter than mine." It was the most profound connection she had ever felt with another soul. He was not just seeing her, he was reading the history of her silent, overlooked life in the very texture of her skin. He was acknowledging her survival, her strength, in a way no one ever had. A tear, hot and unexpected, welled in her eye and traced a path down her cheek. A sharp, authoritative knock at the chamber door shattered the moment. "Your Majesty," a voice called out, Elder Cressa. "The council demands an audience. They will not be turned away again. They question your fitness, your judgment." Thalin's expression hardened, the brief moment of connection gone, replaced by the cold mask of a king. He released Marianne's hand and turned to face the door. "Let them in," he commanded, his voice booming with renewed power. The great doors swung open. Lord Brennus entered first, followed by Cressa and a half-dozen of the pack's highest-ranking lords, their faces a mixture of apprehension and defiant challenge. They stopped just inside the chamber, their eyes taking in the scene. The king, bare-chested and scarred, standing not by the hearth or a throne, but in the center of the room with a plain-faced servant girl. Brennus's gaze was like a physical blow. It swept over Thalin's healing wound and then settled on Marianne with cold, undisguised contempt. "Thalin," he said, dispensing with the royal title in a deliberate act of insolence, "we are relieved to see you on your feet. However, your seclusion with this girl has become a matter of grave concern. The pack needs stability. They need to see their alpha is clear of mine, not swayed by the hysterics of a wolfless Omega." The insult was twofold, a challenge to the king's authority and a public branding of Marianne's deepest shame, wolfless. The word echoed in the sudden, sharp silence of the room. Thalin did not roar. He did not rise to the bait. Instead, a chillingly calm settled over his features. He moved with a deliberate, almost lazy grace, walking past the council members to a large chest at the foot of his bed. He lifted the heavy lid and withdrew a tunic of black leather and a silver chain of office, the Alpha's sigil. He dressed himself slowly, each movement a display of his returning strength, forcing them to wait, to watch, to feel their challenge wither in the face of his immense presence. When he was done, he turned to face them. He was no longer a wounded man in his bedchamber. He was the Alpha King. He walked not to Brennus, but to Marianne. He stopped beside her, placing himself between her and the council, a living shield of muscle and authority. He did not look at her, but addressed the room, his voice soft, yet carrying to every corner. "This is Marianne Locksley," he said, his voice a blade of ice. "The one who saw my life when my own healers were preparing my shroud. The one whose hand does not tremble before the abyss. Her condition is of no consequence." He turned his head then, his storm-gray eyes locking with Brennus's. "From this moment forward, she is under my direct and absolute protection. She will be given quarters adjoining my own. Her word on matters of my health is my word. You will address her not as a servant, but as the keeper of the king's bloom." It was an ancient, long-unused title, given to the one person entrusted with protecting the Alpha's life force from poison or curse. It elevated her from nothing to a position of singular, terrifying importance. "She is the debt I owe for my life," Thalin finished, his voice dropping to a predatory growl. "And I always pay my debts. Consider her my scar, a reminder of my survival, and know this: any who dare to touch her, to threaten her, or to question her place at my side will answer to me, personally." He let the threat hang in the air, a promise of violence more potent than any shout. The Lord shifted uncomfortably. Cressa's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. But it was Brennus's reaction that made Marianne's blood run cold. There was no shock on his face, only a slow, calculating smile, as if the king had just moved his most valuable piece directly into his trap. Brennus's smile was a promise of a slow, cold death. It was the last thing Marianne saw before the council lords, their faces a mixture of fury and grudging submission, turned and swept from the king's chambers. They left behind a silence thick with unspoken threats. Marianne felt as if she had been stripped bare in the center of the great hall, a single flickering candle flame in a gathering hurricane. Keeper of the King's Bloom. The title was a silken noose, a gilded cage. He had not protected her. He had placed her on a pedestal for all his enemies to take aim. "Cressa," Thalin's voice cut through her spiraling panic. "You will see to her accommodations." The head healer, her face rigid with offense, gave a stiff, barely perceptible nod. Her eyes, when they met Marianne's, were chips of flint. The professional pride that had been wounded when Thalin dismissed her skills had now curdled into a deep personal resentment. Marianne was not just an upstart. She was an insult to Cressa's life's work and a violation of the natural order. "This way," Cressa said, her voice clipped and devoid of any warmth. She led Marianne from the king's chambers, not back toward the servants' passages, but down a wide, tapestry-lined corridor reserved for high-ranking members of the court. The air here was different, warmer, scented with beeswax and dried flowers instead of sweat and lye. But to Marianne, it was the sterile, suffocating air of a tomb. Every guard they passed, every servant who scurried out of their path, stared at her. The whispers were like the rustling of dry leaves, just at the edge of hearing, but their meaning was clear. "That's her. The Omega, the wolfless one." The quarters were beautiful. A small private antechamber led to a sleeping room with a bed so soft it felt like sinking into a cloud, a hearth already laid with seasoned birch, and a narrow window overlooking the silent, snow-dusted courtyard. A heavy gown of deep blue velvet, the color of a twilight sky, was laid out on the bed. It was a room fit for a favored lady of the court. It was the most terrifying place Marianne had ever been. "Your duties will be simple, Pa'a," Cressa stated, standing stiffly by the door. "You will attend the king 3 times a day to observe his health. You will taste his food and wine for poison. A servant has been assigned to you for all other needs." She gestured to a young woman who had materialized in the doorway, a girl whose eyes held a mixture of fear and the same thinly veiled contempt as everyone else. "The king has commanded it. We will obey." Her final words were a clear indication that her obedience was to him, not to the situation. It was a threat disguised as compliance. With a final withering look, she was gone. Marianne was left alone in the beautiful, silent room. She walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. The plain gray wool of her servant's dress felt like the only real thing left of her old life. She was a fraud, a lie given a fancy title. Keeper of the King's Bloom. She was keeper of a secret that would get her killed, a wolfless creature pretending to have a mystical connection to an alpha's soul. Hours passed. The assigned servant, a girl named Lyra, brought her a tray of food, stewed meats, soft bread, spiced wine, which Marianne pushed away, her stomach a tight knot of fear. She could not bring herself to touch the velvet dress. Instead, she remained in her worn gray wool, a ghost of her former self haunting this opulent prison. That evening, the heavy oak door swung open without a knock. Thalin filled the doorway, his presence sucking all the air from the room. He was dressed in black leather breeches and a simple linen tunic that did little to hide the formidable breadth of his shoulders. His hair was damp, and he carried the clean, sharp scent of soap in the cold night air. The wound on his chest was now just a dark, healing line, a testament to his incredible vitality. He looked around the room, his eyes taking in the untouched food, the unworn dress, and finally her, huddled by the window like a cornered animal. A frown creased his brow. "I have given you comfort, safety, a position of honor," he said, his voice a low rumble of displeasure. "And yet you look at me as if I have just signed your death warrant." "You have," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. His eyes flashed with anger. In 3 long strides, he crossed the room, backing her against the cold stone of the window casement. He didn't touch her, but he crowded her space, his body a wall of heat and power, trapping her. "I have pulled you from the dirt and placed you at my right hand," he growled, his voice laced with frustration. "I have made you untouchable. Is this how you show your gratitude? By cowering in the shadows?" "Your protection is a target," she countered, her fear giving way to a desperate, reckless courage. "Every lord who resents you, every schemer who wants your throne, now looks at me and sees a weapon to be used against you. Brennus called me your scar. A scar is a weakness, a place to strike. So you would rather I had left you to him? To be threatened and used in the dark?" he demanded, leaning closer. His stormy eyes bored into hers. "I brought you into the light. I gave you my name as a shield." "You gave me a brand," she cried, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. I survived by being invisible. Now everyone is looking at me. Everyone is waiting for me to fail. They whisper that I am a fraud, a wolfless thing." The word hung in the air between them, raw and ugly. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not pity, but a deep, frustrated confusion. He could not comprehend her fear, could not understand a life lived without a wolf, without the power that was as natural to him as breathing. "Then let them whisper," he said, his voice dropping, becoming dangerously soft. "Their words are wind. My word is iron." He reached up, his callous thumb coming to rest on her cheek, just below her eye. His touch was a spark on her cold skin, a jolt that went straight through her. "Why does my protection feel like a cage to you, Marianne?" he murmured, his gaze intense, searching. "What is the secret you guard more closely than your own life? The one that makes you flinch from a king's favor?" He was too close. His scent, pine and iron and the unique primal musk of his own soul, was intoxicating and terrifying. Her heart was a frantic drum against his proximity, a traitorous rhythm that was half fear, half something else, something she refused to name. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, and a devastatingly foolish part of her felt safer in his shadow than she had ever felt in her life. "Because I am the lie they all think I am," she breathed, the confession a ghost of a sound. Before he could demand more, to rip the full truth from her, a sharp, formal knock sounded at the door. Thalen straightened, his expression hardening as he turned away from her. The brief, intense intimacy shattered. "Enter," he commanded. It was Elder Cressa again. She stood in the doorway, her posture rigid, her face a mask of malicious satisfaction. She did not look at the king, but addressed Marianne directly, her voice ringing with false deference. "My Lady Keeper," she began, the title a deliberate, mocking jab. "Lord Brennus, in his capacity as head of the Royal Council, has asked me to inform you of your first official duty." Thalen turned slowly, his eyes narrowing on the healer. "I was not aware the council was assigning duties to my keeper." "It is not an assignment, Your Majesty," Cressa replied smoothly, her gaze still fixed on Marianne. "It is an honor. The annual rite of the blood hunt is to be held in 3 days, to celebrate your miraculous recovery. The pack must give thanks to the moon goddess for returning their alpha." She paused, letting the silence stretch, her words dripping with venom. "As the keeper of the king's bloom, the one most attuned to his life force, it is your honor to lead the invocation. It is a simple matter, of course." Her lips curved into a cruel, knowing smile. "You need only open yourself to the goddess, let your spirit wolf commune with the great pack, and offer a prayer of thanks on behalf of us all." The room spun. Marianne's blood ran cold, turning to slush in her veins. A prayer from her spirit wolf, a communion with the great pack. It was impossible. It was a test she could not pass, a stage upon which she would be publicly, brutally exposed. They had found the perfect weapon, a sacred ritual that would force her to reveal her wolfless, hollow soul. Brennus's trap had been sprung, and as she looked from Cressa's triumphant smirk to the dawning questioning suspicion in the king's stormy eyes, she knew she was utterly, completely alone. The silence that followed Cressa's pronouncement was a living, breathing entity. It swelled to fill the room, pressing in on Marianne, suffocating her. The rite of the blood hunt. Lead the invocation. Let her spirit wolf commune. Each phrase was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile facade of her new life. It was not just a trap. It was a perfectly crafted instrument of humiliation, designed to expose her as a fraud in front of the entire pack, to turn the king's favor into his greatest folly. She looked at Thalen. The initial flicker of suspicion in his eyes had hardened into a piercing, unreadable scrutiny. He was the alpha of alphas. The spiritual health of his pack was as much his responsibility as their physical safety. The rite was sacred. To have it led by a blank would be a profound insult to the goddess, a blight on his reign. He had declared her untouchable, but he had not accounted for a challenge sheathed in the holy cloth of tradition. Brennus and Cressa had outmaneuvered him completely. An honor indeed, Thalen said, his voice deceptively calm. He turned his full attention to the healer, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. So thoughtful of my cousin to remember the old ways with such piety. You may inform the council that their request has been noted. The dismissal was absolute. Cressa gave a curt, satisfied nod and retreated, the click of the door latch sealing Marianne's fate. The moment they were alone, the king's calm shattered. He began to pace the length of the small chamber, a caged lion, his movements filled with a furious, restless energy. He was not angry at Brennus or Cressa. His fury was directed at the situation, at the corner he had been backed into, and Marianne knew, with a sickening certainty, at her. "You will not do it," he said finally, stopping in front of the hearth, his back to her. The firelight cast his shadow long and menacing across the floor. "I have no choice," she whispered. "To refuse is to admit." "To admit what?" He spun on her, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "That you are not what I declared you to be? That the woman who heard my soul is a hollow shell? Wolfless." He said the word as if it were a curse, a thing of profound wrongness. "I felt the hollowness in you from the beginning. I thought it was a shield, a way to hide your true power. But this is a void. And now my enemies have given it a name and a stage." He stalked toward her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Tell me the truth, all of it, now." The demand was an anvil poised to crush her. The secret she had carried for 24 years was a leaden weight in her gut. She had been born under a dark moon, an ill omen. Her mother, a gentle Omega, had died in childbirth. Her father, a simple hunter, had looked at his silent, strange infant daughter and felt not love, but the chilling absence of a wolf's spirit. She had never shifted, not even as a child. She had never felt the stirrings of the beast within, the primal connection to the pack that defined their people. She was a mistake, an empty vessel. To be wolfless was to be less than nothing, a source of shame and bad luck. Her father had hidden her away, taught her to be silent and invisible, and died of a fever when she was 16, leaving her to the charity of the castle kitchens. "There is no wolf," she said, the words tasting like ash. "There never has been. I was born empty." He stared at her, the storm in his eyes churning with a mixture of disbelief and a raw, unwilling comprehension. He had felt it. He had known something was missing, but the reality was more alien than he could have imagined. A shifter with no shift. A wolf with no wolf. "Everything I am is a lie," she continued, the confession spilling out now, a torrent of long-buried pain. "When you were on that bier, I didn't hear your soul. I just saw you breathe. I am no one, just a girl who got lucky, who you mistook for a miracle." He reached her, his hands closing on her upper arms, his grip hard, almost painful. He was not looking at her with contempt, but with a fierce, burning intensity, as if he could force the truth of her into existence through sheer will. "No," he gritted out, his voice a raw rasp. "Luck does not pull a soul back from the abyss. Luck did not make my wolf rise in its sleep to protect you. There is something in you, Marianne, something beyond a wolf, something else." He was wrong, he was desperate to be right, to not have his judgment be so catastrophically flawed, but he was wrong. She was nothing, and in 3 days the entire world would know it. Tears of sheer, hopeless terror began to stream down her face. She began to tremble, not with cold, but with the violent, racking sobs of a lifetime of fear finally breaking free. His expression changed. The fury abated, replaced by something far more complicated, something that looked almost like pain. He saw not a liar or a fraud, but a terrified creature caught in a snare it could not escape. With a low groan that was part frustration, part surrender, he pulled her against him. The movement was sudden, shocking. One moment she was standing before her king, the next she was pressed against the hard wall of his chest. His arms came around her, one hand splayed against her back, the other cradling the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her simple brown hair. The embrace was not gentle or comforting. It was possessive, desperate, an act of claiming, of shielding. He held her as if he were trying to absorb her terror into himself, to crush it with his own strength. The shock of it silenced her sobs. She stood rigid in his arms, her cheek pressed against the warm linen of his tunic, the steady, powerful beat of his heart a drum against her ear. She could smell the soap on his skin, the faint scent of leather and pine, the primal musk of the alpha. It was overwhelming, a sensory flood that short-circuited her fear. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, tentatively came to rest on his chest, her fingers curling into the rough fabric. "They will not have you," he murmured into her hair, his voice a vow, a deep guttural promise that vibrated through his chest and into hers. "Brennus will not use you to break me. I will not let them put you on that pyre." "How?" she whispered against his chest, her voice muffled. "What can you do? It is the right. It is sacred." "Then I will profane it," he answered, his voice hard as iron. He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his hands still gripping her arms. His stormy eyes were dark, burning with a reckless, terrible resolve. "There is one law that stands above all others, even the sacred rights. One claim that cannot be denied, the Alpha's claim." Her breath hitched. She knew of it, of course. Every shifter did. It was a remnant of a more brutal age, a primal bond that could be invoked by an Alpha King in a time of great crisis. A mating bond. Not one of love or courtship, but of power and possession. An Alpha could claim any unmated female in the pack, binding her to him, making her an extension of his own will, his own spirit. A claimed mate could not be challenged, could not be touched. She became as sacred and untouchable as the Alpha himself. "No," she breathed, shaking her head, the full horror of his words crashing down on her. "Yes," he countered, his gaze unwavering. "It is the only way. I will claim you. I will bind your empty soul to mine. Whatever you lack, I will provide. When you stand before the pack to lead the invocation, it will be my wolf, my spirit that speaks through you. They will see my power flowing through you, and they will have no choice but to bow." It was a monstrous solution, a violation on a spiritual level. He would force his own soul into the void inside her, using her as a vessel, a puppet, to display his power. She would be utterly and completely consumed by him, her own small identity erased, replaced by his. "It will destroy me," she whispered, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "It will save you," he said, his voice raw. He looked at her, at the tear tracks on her pale cheeks, at the terror in her wide gray eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the iron resolve in his own gaze wavered. A flicker of doubt, of regret crossed his face. He was not a monster. He was a king doing what he had always done, choosing the brutal, necessary path. "There is no other way, Marianne," he said, his voice softening, but his purpose did not. "This is the debt I owe you, a cage for a cage, my protection for your freedom, my soul for your life." And then, before she could protest, before she could scream or run, he lowered his head. His lips crashed down on hers. It was not a kiss of tenderness or passion. It was an act of sealing a pact, an invasion, a brand of fire and will. It was rough, demanding, and utterly consuming. His mouth claimed hers with a raw, desperate power that stole the air from her lungs and the strength from her limbs. She tasted the sharp tang of spiced wine on his tongue, and the deeper, wilder flavor of the man himself, of the Alpha, of the wolf. A shockwave of pure energy coursed through her, a bolt of lightning that struck the hollow place inside her chest. It was agonizing, it was electrifying. And in that terrifying, blinding moment, as he kissed her, as he poured his will, his essence into her, she felt something she had never felt before. A flicker, deep in the void, in the silent, empty place where her wolf should have been. A single impossible ember sparked to life. It was faint, a ghost of a thing, but it was there. A spark of borrowed power, of primal, feral life, ignited by the overwhelming force of the Alpha's claim. 1 year later, the wind that swept down from the ancestor peaks no longer felt like a threat. Marianne stood on the high stone balcony of the king's chambers, her hands resting on the cold, weathered stone. It was a place she had once feared, and now it was her home. The deep blue velvet of her gown was a familiar weight against her skin, the silver chain around her neck, a delicate echo of the king's own sigil of office, cool against her throat. Below, the castle bustled with the quiet, confident energy of a pack at peace. The snows of the long winter had finally melted, and the first stubborn wildflowers were pushing their way through the damp earth in the courtyard. A new season had come, a new life. She was no longer the keeper of the king's bloom, a title born of desperation. She was the queen, not by blood or by politics, but by a bond forged in fire and shadow, a claim that had rewritten the laws of their people and the very nature of her own soul. Her mind drifted back, as it sometimes did, to the night of the blood hunt. The memory was no longer a thing of terror, but a sharp, defining moment. Like a lightning strike that had burned a new landscape into her world. She remembered standing before the assembled pack in the torchlit clearing, the air thick with the scent of pine and anticipation. The cold dread had been a knot of ice in her stomach. Cressa's smirk, Brennus's confident sneer, they were all waiting for her to crumble. And then she had felt him. Thalen standing behind her, his presence a mountain at her back. He had reached out, not with his hand, but with his spirit, and touched the void inside her. The Alpha's claim, which had begun with a brutal kiss of possession, now bloomed into a torrent of power. It was not a violation, it was a flood. His strength, his spirit, his ancient, indomitable wolf poured into her, not to replace what was missing, but to fill it, to join with it. When she had opened her mouth to speak the invocation, the voice that emerged was hers, yet it resonated with his power, a harmony of two souls singing one song. The pack had fallen to its knees, not in fear, but in profound awe. They had felt the sheer, overwhelming force of their Alpha, not diminished by his curse, but magnified, amplified through the impossible conduit of his chosen mate. Brennus had not been able to accept it. Blinded by rage and ambition, he had issued a formal challenge right there in the sacred clearing, accusing Thalen of dark magic, of using a soulless puppet to trick the pack. The fight had been brutal, primal, and mercifully short. Thalen, fueled by the righteous fury of a king and the perfect resonant harmony of their new bond, had moved like a storm given flesh. He had not killed his cousin. He had broken him, shattered his alpha pride, and cast him out, a lone wolf exiled to the blighted borderlands, his name stricken from the records. His defeat had been so absolute that no one had dared to question Thalen's rule, or his choice of queen, ever again. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back against a familiar wall of warmth and muscle. A heavy head rested on her shoulder, and the scent of pine, iron, and home filled her senses. "You are 1,000 miles away," Thalen's voice rumbled, a low vibration against her ear. She leaned back into his embrace, her body relaxing into his, with an ease that had been earned over months of shared nights and quiet dawns. "I was just visiting the past," she murmured, placing her hands over his on her stomach. "Let it stay there," he said, his lips brushing against her temple. "The present is far more interesting." He was different now. The harsh, brutal edges of the warrior king had been softened, not with weakness, but with a deep, abiding peace she had never thought to see in him. The curse was long gone, burned away by the strength of their bond, leaving not even a scar behind. His alpha spirit, once a raging storm he constantly fought to contain, was now a deep, powerful ocean, calm on the surface, its incredible power held in a steady, perfect balance with her own quiet soul. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. a question she had never dared to voice before. The claim, forcing your soul upon me. You had no idea what it would do. He was silent for a long moment, his arms tightening around her. I regret the necessity of it, he said finally, his voice raw with the memory of her terror. I regret that I had to hurt you to save you, but I do not regret the bond. He turned her in his arms to face him, his storm-gray eyes, once so cold, now filled with a fierce, tender light that was reserved only for her. I was wrong, Marianne. Your whole life, you were told you were empty, a void. I thought so too, but a void is not nothing. It is a space waiting to be filled. My soul was a storm without a harbor, an overflowing river without a sea to run to. Any other woman, any other wolf, would have been shattered by my spirit, but you were made for it. You were not empty, you were my other half. He cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. I have no wolf without you, and you have no wolf without me. It is not my spirit speaking through you. It is ours, together. It was the truth she had come to understand. The spark ignited by his claim had not grown into a separate wolf within her. It had grown into a bridge, a permanent, unbreakable connection between their souls. She could feel his strength as if it were her own, and he drew upon her quiet, steady calm to temper his own fire. She was not a vessel for his power. She was the missing piece of it, the silence that gave his roar its meaning. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like their first kiss. There was no desperation, no violence of will. It was a kiss of deep, profound love, a quiet conversation between two souls who had found their impossible home in each other. It was a promise of a shared throne, a shared life, a shared spirit. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. The kingdom has its king, he murmured, his breath warm against her lips. And the king has his heart. She looked up at him, the terrifying Alpha King who had been resurrected from the dead, the man who had claimed her, the husband she had grown to love with a fierceness that rivaled his own. In his eyes, she was no longer a wolfless Omega, a servant girl, a mistake. She was his queen, his anchor, his salvation. And he was hers. Two souls, one wolf, forever.